Welcome everyone to Growth Sessions. Today we have an amazing guest. We have Calvin Lammers, who has maintained fantastic e-commerce leadership roles at brands like Buy Brands, Health Aid Kombucha, Truff. I'm forgetting a few. Calvin, fill me in on the few that I'm forgetting, and even some from before. Where have you worked? Where haven't you worked?
Where haven't I worked is the better question, I think. Yeah, thanks for having me, Adam. So yeah, I cut my teeth on the brand side at Kind Snacks. Great brand, great kind of case study in leveraging e-com to disrupt an entrenched category. Then was also at Spindrift and built out their e-commerce channel at Spindrift Sparkling Waters. I've seen a lot of things in my heyday throughout the brand space.
And you've seen some ups and downs in industry across the rise of D2C, the fall of DTC, challenges of an emerging brand entering channels like Amazon or Instacart during COVID. You have seen it all, and we'd love to talk about all of those things today. I think one of the biggest questions is for challenger brands and emerging CPG brands like the ones that you've worked at and have had leadership roles in. One of the biggest questions is how people should view the intersection between retail media and these highly, highly profitable channels such as Amazon, or high volume potential channels such as Amazon, and D2C. And so perhaps we should begin there.
Yeah. And I think that's the right way to, or the right place to start. It's kind of to your point, it's been very fascinating to see kind of the evolution in terms of channel strategy and approach with the digital channel as a whole, as it very much used to be the case where had brands that only focus on DTC or only focus on Amazon, or they were only in retail. Obviously, that's a legacy mindset that no longer exists. You have to be and succeed in all three kind of channels or areas in order to have a brand. And I think that if we were to sum it up in a quick kind of tidbit or kind of cliff note, it's you have to build a brand, and the best way to do it is to have a unified channel strategy or omnichannel strategy, unified commerce, whatever you want to call it. So you have to have that important plan strategy to tackle that, and along with that also clearly defining what roles and what the objectives are for each channel. Is DTC a primary revenue driver for your business? Is it an experiential educational element? Is retail where you're focused on volume driving and you want to have DTC be the influence channel to drive that offline retail? So you have to clearly think that through. I think in the grocery space, where I spent a lot of my time, 95% of sales are still taking place offline. So that's where, as you're kind of thinking over that 3 to 5 year roadmap, you are maybe leveraging e-com, DTC, Amazon as an initial kind of discovery trial driver. But then long term, the majority of your revenue is going to come from retail. So you have to plan that out, how you're best setting up those retail channels with your digital drivers to influence the retail component. So it is that cohesive collective strategy and how you're kind of planning that out for that long-term growth.
And you like to view it as a bit of a three-legged stool.
That's my moniker, the three-legged stool.
So what is the three-legged stool?
So I really do see that as those three kind of components. So you have retail media side, you have the DTC components, and then you have marketplaces or Amazon pure play retailers at the end of the day. Obviously, there's some nuances along with that, as you have like an Instacart that has come up and blurs those lines between a delivery partner, retail channel. But more or less, those are the three big buckets. And obviously, there's interconnectivity and dots connecting all three. But along with that, that's where you do need to succeed in all three. And I think as recently, kind of a post-COVID world, the death of DTC, or kind of the come down of the great run that DTC had with very efficient acquisition costs and a huge growth in the online user base. Now brands are focused again on how are we succeeding in retail and pivoting our focus into retail, and then maintaining a sufficient Amazon business along with it. So those three key buckets and defining what rolls up in them is the key structural components, I think, to set up.
Yeah, let's unbundle all three. And I think D2C is a great place to start. So your time at Spindrift was probably at the rise of D2C, right? When everyone was talking about all things D2C, everyone needed a D2C strategy. It was this magical panacea of ways to be profitable that never existed before, when realistically it was just a different distribution channel funneled, powered by Facebook and Instagram ads. Yeah. How do you think the role of D2C has evolved as an emerging CPG brand over the past 5 years? And more particularly, within that evolution as a brand, as the brand scales, what is the role of D2C once you achieve a certain level of scale?
Yeah, I think it's certainly gotten much more difficult and expensive. And I think that's the easy answer that everybody in the DTC space knows. So whether that's post-ATT changes, but just overall competitiveness in the space, it used to be very easy for your media mix. You would put 100% of your budget in Facebook, IG all day, every day, and just focus on scaling that. And it was pretty straightforward for the most part. Obviously, some nuance along with that. And I think that's where obviously saw a massive increase in the rise of performance marketing and drop shippers, knowing how you can more or less kind of tweak the system and Facebook to ultimately scale a business very quickly. And I think you saw a kind of boon of that over the last few years. And obviously during COVID, early part of COVID, that only prompted up even more so on the consumable food and beverage side. Now, obviously, it's gotten much more difficult with the privacy changes, costs increasing dramatically. So it's gotten much more diversified. You've had to be a lot more sophisticated in terms of your tech stack that you're going along with just your basic media mix. So it's not as much of a kind of rote playbook to scaling a DTC business quickly. So as you're thinking about that, that's where a lot of brands have made that shift to focus on Amazon, to focus on retail. So it's definitely gotten more complex. I don't think it ever was easy, but I think that's where long-term you look at a lot of grocery brands again, where there's a ceiling on that revenue, because as I mentioned earlier, 90% of grocery sales are taking place in retail. So that's how you're evolving the purpose and value that DTC is placing, because it should be a revenue driver and focus channel early on. But if you're building $1 billion brand, you're not going to have a $500 million DTC business on top of that. That's still going to be that the percentage of the total company revenue is going to continue to kind of drop down as you scale the brand. And it should, frankly, I think, as you're building a major, massive grocery brand. What that means for the purpose of DTC, I find that being more of that continuing educational, experiential membership, LTV focus. You're really focused on those kind of high value customers, your initial touch points, really expanding and using that kind of billboard opportunity you have with the DTC component to have the initial touch point, and then also push further with that retention and engagement with customers. And that really, I think, should be a centerpiece as brands continue to build and scale out their business.
So to paraphrase a little bit there, aside from the cost component, as a brand scales, there is a certain cap of types of customers who are willing to purchase your products on DTC, and DTC as a percentage of total sales will continue to diminish as you scale, because there is less of a cap on other channels such as retail and Amazon, as an example.
Exactly.
And the rule at that scale level should be to harness there's this like common essay that people refer to as like 1,000 true fans. I'm not sure if you know that essay. So like yep. DTC is your 1,000 true fans of your most ardent power users that you are trying to maximize. You mentioned subscription. You're trying to maximize LTV, maximize AOV, and provide those customers with unique experiences through the levels of engagement that D2C provide that other channels do not.
100%. And you're also, I think, early on, one of the invaluable things with DTC business is that you're able to essentially activate those loyal fans as ambassadors for the brand, more or less word of mouth referral marketing at the most efficient costs that you could possibly find in the space. So I think it's all those intangibles and why it plays such a valuable role with a brand, especially early on.
Are there any examples of brands at scale that you think are doing an awesome job of focusing on that activation and engagement with the top customers that you can share?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple that would come to mind. I think Liquid Death, I think, is a great example right off the bat that has done a great job of that. And they've actually pivoted, kind of case in point, where they started off as a digitally native brand, launched DTC, launched on Amazon. As their business scaled, they pivoted away from DTC from a revenue driving vehicle. They obviously have a great merch program that's now the focus primarily on DTC, but now it's more about the community building and their overall loyalty fan club that they built out a great example of at Liquid Death. So I think that's an immediate one that comes right to top of mind. I think Truff, as you mentioned earlier, where I obviously was at, did a great job building a community engagement around that. And really, I think that's where you see a lot of success in leveraging both the high loyalty users, but then also just your community as a whole. That is where your power as a brand really comes to fruition. Olipop is a great example as well on the brand space that they've really tapped into a great community environment. They have a platform around that. So it's, I think the amount of people with Olipop, for example, that I've heard before, maybe a couple years ago, and kind of word of mouth pass along their subscription information, like they signed up for Olipop subscription, and then we're sharing photos around it. That's all community-based, small micro engagement. Brands like that and how you're promoting that and building a loyalty or referral program to help promote that is crucial.
Yeah, the notion of community for a water company sounds almost people would never have thought about that even 10 years ago. I feel like community for an emerging CPG brand is such a loaded term. What does that actually mean? If you're advising an emerging CPG brand on building a community, or one says, I really want to build a community, what does that entail? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, I think right off the bat, it has to be a two-way street. So I think you have a lot of brands that in their eyes or their view, community is a one-way street where you're essentially communicating or pushing along a message to your community or your followers. But really, if you look at the most successful communities, it's those brands that have created that two-way street and that conversation, I guess, with their audience. So whether that is on their social platforms through content or replies, or that is through some brands building out great SMS programs where you have that more conversational commerce, that's really where I see that it's going one step further with that relationship. That again, that is where the power and the value, I think, in DTC lies, that you can't necessarily have in retail or on a marketplace. You can get there to a certain extent, but the depth that you can go with that relationship and that communication, two-way street, is invaluable on your own channels and DTC along with that.
Makes total sense. And so when we were talking about the costs of doing business on D2C, the natural costs that everyone loves to talk about is ATT changes and rising CAC, and the channels with which people acquired customers is no longer nearly as efficient as they used to be. But there's another cost to D2C in that it has a heavy operational burden. And I think that's the cost that people don't talk about enough.
Right.
And being an e-commerce leader that led teams that manage those operations, like, why don't people talk about that operational cost enough?
We'll call it the less glamorous, less sexy area of focus, I guess, with that space. And that's an unfortunate kind of happenstance, I guess, because I like to say that I know way more about operational processes, 3PLs, warehousing, pick, pack, and ship components and costs than I ever thought I would getting into e-com, because it is, especially with some of the products and brands that I've worked with, being in the beverage space, one of the more cost-intensive possible products that you're fulfilling, a hefty, sizable product, not the highest price points either in many instances. So finding efficiencies and improvements from a P&L on the 3PL warehousing operational component is crucial to building a viable e-commerce and digital business as well. So I think more people don't talk about it just because it's the less flashy component of the business. But I really do strongly believe that you need a killer, absolutely gangbusters operational team in order to have a successful and viable channel. And so when I'm even looking at a business or a brand that's looking up at building out an e-com digital DTC strategy, operational hires are usually one of the first needed, necessary internal hires that I think you need to bring on to get the foundational pillars set. And you need to set that from the beginning.
Yeah. And the challenge, obviously, with a lot of this operational work on D2C is that it scales linearly, right? As you begin to get that next multiple of sales, you need to hire the operational team to manage all of the things that need to be managed internally. Whereas something like retail and Amazon can scale exponentially.
Right.
The people that are working on those, you get operating leverage through the additional profits that you get from those channels.
Yes.
Whereas D2C, in addition to having the cap on total sales of people that are going to purchase your products there, you also have to build team and build people, which is a very, very hard thing to do in order to scale to the level that people want.
That's it. And John Denny will tell you the same thing. But when I worked with John at Buy, we had an instance where there was a very big focus in building out a DTC storefront for Buy, given when we had already built out a massive Amazon business. And I strongly recommended that we did not build out a DTC storefront at that point, because unit economics, the amount of resources, headcount that we were going to have to add to our P&L in order to build up and scale out a DTC business while we already had this massive Amazon business, it didn't make financial sense for us to that exact point. So yeah, I think you have to have that comprehensive view of what a DTC business includes, as to your point, resources are much more intensive from a DTC perspective compared to some of the other channels and how that scales.
And then wrapping up our D2C focus of the three-legged stool, for a emerging brand that probably hasn't hired that e-commerce leader yet,
Right.
that's looking for that e-commerce leader, how would you advise that brand in what are the characteristics and traits that they need to look for in that Swiss Army knife of a leader to be able to take them to the next level?
Yeah, I think you need somebody that doesn't have much of an ego, because if you're in this space, you constantly have to be learning and open to be proven wrong, or being open to discovering new ways of approaching things. Because the playbook that I had at Kind Snacks, the playbook that I had at Spindrift, like you were saying, it no longer applies anymore because the landscape has changed so quickly and extensively. So I think you have to have somebody that's curious, that's open-minded, that loves problem solving and challenge solving. I think if you're to sum up my role typically on a day-to-day basis, it's problem solving on a day-to-day basis and figuring out new ways of overcoming hurdles and challenges. So having that inquisitive, curious mind that is a problem solver, I think at a high level is the type of personality that you should look for. Because you also have a ton of different backgrounds that have gotten into e-commerce and DTC. I was a sport management major that somehow landed in e-commerce and built out a path for myself. And you have a number of other people that came up through maybe operations or through sales. You can learn it, but that it's a mindset and mentality for the leader, for the person that you're looking to bring in, that really matters the most.
And then aside from that mindset, like hard skills, you mentioned the operational component is really important.
Very analytical mind, crucial.
Understanding of paid media, like where in the curve should you recommend of paid media? I feel like paid media and operational excellence are two like of the biggest buckets that people look for. What's most important, if any, or is it just a really good combination of the two?
I think ultimately, ideally, a combination of the two, but I think if you have to put a priority or kind of rank the two, I would put operational over paid media, because I think there are a lot of great external or partners that you could bring on from a paid media perspective or growth perspective, that whether that's an agency base, what have you, I think that's more readily available from an external partnership or kind of perspective. Operational, less so, even though they do exist, but I think operational to have internal is the more important or higher importance placed on between the two.
Let's get to Amazon, the second leg of that stool. What are your views towards Amazon?
I've been a big Amazon proponent for a long time. I think for those who know me, that's not surprising to hear. And I think it's been interesting to see that, as we were talking earlier, that there's been maybe a light bulb moment for a lot of DTC only brands or digitally native brands that maybe have caught religion, I guess we'll call it, over the last 2 years, and realized that they're missing a massive opportunity with getting in front of consumers on Amazon. And I think the idea of only having a DTC brand or DTC only brand and not wanting to be on Amazon, that idea or thought, for the most part, I think has gone away for a reason. Because if you're looking at the biggest set of eyeballs and influence from a shopping perspective, Amazon still is the leader in the space. So you have to at least have a presence, and if not, ideally win on Amazon to have a successful brand. You need to win on Amazon to do so.
And the fun change on Amazon is that there's now opportunities to build brand and not just drive sales on Amazon. And a great way to do that is obviously through advertising.
Yeah.
Within the world of Amazon ads, where do you see efficiencies these days for an emerging brand?
Yeah, I think it's gotten much more crowded. CPCs have obviously continued to increase as more advertisers join the platform. And I think that's one of the challenges that brands are facing now, is that as there's more of a push for brands and non-endemic brands to start advertising on the platform, it's only getting more costly. So I think that's where you have to continually test. I think there's a ton of different placements, ad product types that now have been rolled out. So I really think you, as a brand, you need to test everything and find where your efficiencies lie in terms of what targeting, what ad types. Even with brands that I've talked with, and at some previous brands, saw a ton of success, really great return on using PAT campaigns for conquesting brands. But that worked for a couple of brands that I led. Didn't work for other brands that tried similar perspectives. So what works for one brand or one category doesn't work for the other. So I think having that continual testing mind is important. But yeah, PAT, since I mentioned a PAT, sponsored display, conquesting, competitor brand targeting, saw a lot of high affinity and performance there. Sponsored brand video has continued to be one of the most stable, consistent performing ad units. So I think there's a reason why it seems Amazon's continuing to open up the placement for video, as video in general has continued to come with a vengeance, I guess, in the ad space. So sponsored brand video, and then OLV for a more upper funnel tactic. Obviously have tested and run streaming TV, connected TV previously, but really have seen OLV work as the best performing video upper funnel awareness tactic. So I've really focused on that heavily with the last couple of brands that I've been at and seen a ton of success with OLV.
And to clarify on that last one, OLV is powered by Amazon DSP. So these are Amazon DSP ads serving on like display inventory, but rather than a static image, it's video placements using top of funnel tactics, focusing on new to brand customers. Yeah.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think it has a lot of the benefits of connected TV, streaming TV, while also obviously having the ability to drive detail page views and get a number of glance views that you can then add obviously into your retargeting mix as a result.
How did you think about the creative on those OLV campaigns?
It's interesting. Have tested out a few different types of creative, and really that's where I think the best performance we saw was actually taking streaming TV creative and running it on OLV as the setting, the engagement factor that you're looking for in that kind of that creative worked extremely well in that placement. And that's where just the benefit you have is that the click-throughs and in-detail page views that you're getting from that unit. I think there's been, more kind of benefit, maybe UGC creative as well, that's worked well on the OLV side, but really that more kind of brand marketing message focused creative has worked extremely well in that placement from what I've seen.
And obviously, I guess the big benefit is you can approach budgets in a much more conservative fashion than a streaming TV campaign in which you need to go all in.
Yeah.
I think that's a fun topic. Like having gone through streaming TV campaigns as the e-commerce leader going to financial or company leadership saying, hey, I want this budget to run a streaming TV campaign on Amazon. That's a really hard conversation that a lot of e-commerce leaders haven't been equipped to do so until the last few years. Like how should one approach doing something like that?
Yeah, and I've certainly faced similar difficult conversations, challenges. It's certainly not an easy one to have. I think that's where backing it up with data, white papers, case studies really has been beneficial in my experience. If you can come with a number of different case studies, analytic partners or analytic index is one that I've used in the past that they have a number of great kind of case studies for the impact that TV has had both online and offline in terms of any ad attributed sales impact. So that's been super helpful. And then just looking from an audience perspective, I think there's a lot of great studies and information just around the ability to improve your reach and visibility with an entirely different audience set via TV that you wouldn't otherwise get with some of these other ad products or ad types. I think that's been another valuable kind of piece that I've added to the mix. And obviously that's dependent on what stage the brand is at. If your brand is Amazon only, hasn't broken into retail, doing under 10 million annually, doesn't likely make sense to do TV at that point. So I think that's the other piece is that TV, I think, is definitely a component that should only be leveraged or added once you reach a certain scale or stage as well.
So that's how you approach the conversation.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know how you came up with the number to ask for.
Yeah.
For that STV budget. Was it a function of total DSP spend over a quarter?
It was actually an annual percentage of that DSP spend. As we're looking at building out that full funnel, I added 20% of the total DSP budget to be that true full upper funnel awareness marketing or awareness campaign. And so used that rough 20% total DSP budget number to back into that TV budget that I was asking for.
And then when it did happen, what were the important metrics for you and the company?
Yeah.
And, how are you able to demonstrate that? You mentioned analytic index as one of the tools in your toolkit. Were there other tools? And at the time, what were some of the gaps in the reporting that you wish you had in order to tell the story of what those upper funnel commitments have on the holistic business? Yeah.
And that's where scale definitely helps with having a larger, more comprehensive attribution reporting tool. When I was at Buy and we had millions of dollars of TV that was running, we were able to activate Oracle offline impact studies. So we had real hard measure to show every dollar that we spent with our advertising campaign. We actually drove $7 in ad attributed sales and offline sales. That obviously was the case at Buy, much larger budgets. At some of the more recent brands, obviously smaller budgets that we weren't able to add offline attribution sales. So it was more leading indicators, more or less. So looking at brand searches, overall detail page visits, sessions, etc. But then also adding in some brand tracking measurements. There's a couple of different platforms out there that you can use panel data to track overall brand affinity, brand awareness, brand health metrics. And so I think without having a full kind of closed loop attribution model available, it's those tools or platforms that I think are super helpful to see how much you're impacting the overall awareness, the sentiment around the brand, and then ultimately looking at how much additional consideration with brand searches and detail page visits that you're generating. Obviously, sales being a component of that, but that's usually a little bit of a lag factor with a TV campaign, at least from what I've seen.
Did you view it as success, the TV campaign?
I did. Yeah. I think if you're looking at the overall, again, those initial leading indicators, seeing overall revenue growth and when that revenue growth or velocity growth starts in comparison to when you started the TV campaign, it's certainly directional, but I certainly viewed it as a success. And I think as you're trying to cut through the noise or the clutter, I think, as you mentioned earlier, that's still one of the most efficient and best ways to do it. You can't get better reach or visibility on any other channel.
And did the leadership team that okayed that budget view it as success? And have they run future streaming TV campaigns?
Yeah, so it's been, I think, hit or miss. We'll say it's been split. That's where I think the conversation goes, where is that a performance channel? I don't think so. I think it is still a brand awareness channel. So from that perspective, viewed it as a success. I think that the question mark that I would have, and I've never run one where it is purely focused on performance, having an end card attributed coupon code. I think there are successful examples of that. I don't think that's the best use of TV necessarily, but I think that is certainly an option. But from my perspective, or instances have always used it as a brand awareness driving vehicle and in promoting searches and in-store traffic and velocity as a result. And from that perspective, I think it's been successful.
Let's get to the third leg of the stool, which is retail.com sites and what everyone is calling retail media these days. These retail sites have obviously evolved a lot over the past few years. Before, you could barely bid on a keyword or get the reporting that you required. And now that's starting to quickly evolve across a variety of retail channels.
Which is great.
How should advertisers and brands think about these retail channels, and when should they start investing in them?
Yeah, so I think obviously distribution is first and foremost that you need to be available at, and I don't think there's a hard and fast rule, but like an Instacart, for example, if you're only in 500 doors, it likely doesn't make a ton of sense for you to focus on really investing heavily in the platform yet. So I think distribution is a crucial factor, and specifically if any retail media, specific channels like a KPM with Kroger or Walmart Connect, if you aren't in those stores, it doesn't make sense. So that's step one. Getting into the stores, into the retailer seems obvious. Along with that, it's also looking at your customer audience, your kind of profile, and where the opportunity is. I think one thing that I've seen is that, and I've heard from a lot of folks, in that if you're looking at like a Walmart, for instance, Walmart delivery still is minuscule if you're looking at the total percentages of where they're seeing volume from their .com business. It's still larger, at least in the grocery space, still largely pickup. So if that's not where your business is, or that's not where your focus is, you should think about how you're prioritizing or what ad units you're looking at for Walmart. If you have an emerging delivery focused business on Walmart, that's going to change your strategy. Instacart, I think, has been a good example of they've been leaning in more with emerging brands and in helping them share data that they otherwise maybe wouldn't have access to, and helping them to be that partner as they continue to build out their retail strategy. And I think that's what a lot of emerging brands are looking for. Kroger, some other retail media sites, they have an advantage over an Amazon, maybe, as Amazon still in many ways, they're opening it up, but Amazon has that black box and they've been reticent to share data. It's still kind of a platform, whereas some of these other retail sites or retail media platforms, they really are positioning themselves as they're a partner with brands and really full access or opening up access to data as benefit of advertising with them. And that's, I think, a key differentiator for them, right?
What are some of those data sets that you get access to at some of these retailers that you wouldn't get at an Amazon, out of curiosity?
Yeah, and obviously Amazon is developing that, still kind of nascent, I think, but having that closed loop attribution again is crucial for some of these retailers. So if you're running a programmatic campaign with Kroger and you can get in-store attributed sales from your DSP campaign that you're running, that's invaluable from a marketer's perspective. So you can have that hard data to go back and say, not only did we drive X amount of sales on the .com business, we also drove X amount in store, and that validates it. It helps from a forecasting, budget planning perspective, and ultimately kind of measures of success that, unfortunately, if you're advertising solely on Amazon, you're still looking at these other tools to truly measure the full impact or success of that campaign. campaign. So I think that's been key. And then Walmart has done similar things with opening up in-store attribution, in-store placements, and just more enhanced reporting around the actual kind of true shopper behavior, kind of post-purchase behavior with brand.
And I think it's really impactful to be running Walmart DSP campaigns and being able to measure in-store sales against the ROAS of those DSP campaigns. I think that's a huge addition that Walmart has, and it's a way that they can flex differences against something like an Amazon. And you're actually quite high on Kroger, from what I understand. I think, you think they've evolved a lot over the last few years, and there's ways to drive even further scale with them.
I think so. I mean, from an investment or resource standpoint, I think they've done a great job with their acquisitions, whether it's the Vitacost acquisition years ago now, the Ocado investment and partnership. I think they placed a lot of great bets. I think they built out a great advertising team and really evolved and advanced their ad product pretty quickly. And I think that's the other measure, that everybody's playing catch up more or less to Walmart or to Amazon as it stands, just as Amazon was the first mover. So they have that advantage. But I think where some of the retailers have the advantage is in terms of the data that they're able to share. And that's obviously one key pillar, but then also how they're advancing and kind of listening to customer feedback. And I think that's where I've seen Kroger has done a great job. Walmart's done a great job. Frankly, I think Instacart has done one of the best jobs in terms of just this last year and how quickly they've evolved and rolled out new products and their roadmap on the advertising side. And I think it was needed on their end, and obviously happily welcome on the brand side with the improvements that they made.
What are some of those improvements and evolutions from Instacart that excite you?
So a lot of the reporting that previously you could only get from your rep, that's now a self-service portal. So I think some of those basic ones that seem obvious, but actually is incredibly invaluable. They've included a number of different ad product type placements for video, more upper funnel tactics. And then I guess on the attribution incrementality studies side, that is something that they've heard from brands time and time again in terms of what is the incremental sales that they're driving from campaigns. And that's something that they're incorporating in their kind of product roadmap. So I think that direct feedback loop with the team over there, I've noticed pretty significantly. And I think the speed at what they're solving for that has been impressive.
At Truff, your most recent company, you ran a really awesome, impactful collaboration in which I'll talk about it because I think I can, and I'm not sure to what extent you can. And this is all readily available information if anyone wants to check it out. And I'm sure many of you have even seen this collab. But Truff, which is a hot sauce company, ran a collab with Hidden Valley Ranch, which is very much a legacy ranch sauce brand, but it was done in a very tasteful and impactful way in which it created an air of exclusivity by packaging this collab in a beautifully designed box with very limited supply at a very high price point. And I'm sure that the overall total sales of that collab did not nearly meet the brand affinity that was created for both Hidden Valley and Truff. And while I won't ask you about the specifics of how that partnership came about, I'd love to learn more about your views on how brands should think about collaborations with other brands like that, because I think now more than ever is a really impactful time for brands to stand out by leveraging the reach of another brand. So would love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And I think both with the collabs, but then also just, I think there's been a number of good articles recently about this, how brands are kind of mirroring the drop kind of culture of whether that's shoes or street fashion, street culture. And that's clearly something that has came about in the last couple of years. And brands have started to realize the power that both really great partnerships and in collabs and drops along with that, and in what they can do from brand building, buzzworthiness, and also sharing some brand equity across brands that might be tapping into a new audience that you otherwise wouldn't have. You mentioned Truff, which is a great example, and I've talked to a number of brands in the space. That's where they see the value with increasing acquisition costs. You're kind of going back to the drawing board and seeing where can we reach a new audience for the most efficient possible dollar. And if you're thinking about it, partnerships and collabs is one of the more efficient ways that you can market your product by tapping into a new audience that you might not otherwise have been able to get in front of. And if you share that kind of brand currency and equity in a way that validates it or carries more weight with that audience of the brand you're collabing with or working with, than if you're just running paid ad campaign to a cold audience that might be an existing consumer. So at least that's how I think about it. And I think brands are, realizing that more and more. And you've seen a number of different brands doing more collabs and drops like that in the space, and even platforms on the DTC side that are opening up like a Disco that are focused on enabling the collaborations and partnerships a little bit more in a turnkey solution.
And what are the metrics for success? Like when something like that happens, I say it's successful because I saw it and I thought it was cool. But like, how does leader of brand determine that be a successful collab?
Yeah, I think obviously sales is an important one, even though that's obviously not the primary one, and that'll be dependent on the brand and obviously quantities that they're building. So sales is one, how quickly you're seeing those sales come through, sign up list ways. If you have a wait list, how many emails are you collecting in order to build up that wait list for the product drop? Key one. And then you have some maybe vanity metrics, but if you're looking at overall impressions, article pickup, brand search increases. So if you're seeing a Domino's collab with somebody and you see a huge surge in Domino's plus this brand, that carries a lot of weight from a brand affinity and buzzworthiness moment. So I think combination of those, vanity along with some hard sales, metrics along with it.
And then when do you know to do the next one? Is collab an always on strategy for a brand?
I don't think it can be, because then it dilutes it for sure. So I don't think it can be an always on strategy. So you definitely have to do it selectively. I don't know if there's a hard and fast number, but I think doing roughly more than one per quarter would be too aggressive. You could if you have the right partnership, but you need enough space in between them to make sure that you're not diluting that value that comes with each drop, both in the consumer's eyes, but then also just if you have another collab after you just did one the previous week, it carries less weight in that new audience you're getting in front of too, I think.
And then an extension of this would be there's brand with brand collabs, but more and more brands are collaborating with creators who are effectively their own personal mini brands. So how should a brand think about creator collabs? Not necessarily creator collabs, but in general, working with creators. What is the blueprint for successful creator operations for an emerging brand?
Yeah, I think one thing, and this is where I think being an emerging brand, you maybe have a little bit more flexibility with this or not. It's a good question, because I think one thing that I've seen with working with creators, it needs to be authentic to the creator. It can't be just them being kind of a voice piece for a brand. It needs to be translated in their own creative style, tone of voice, etc. And I think sometimes that can be tough with how brands translate their own tone of voice to allow for that messaging or positioning with the creator. So I think from a starting point, you need to be okay with maybe stretching the brand a little bit in terms of guidelines, tone of voice, etc., so that you're meeting the audience of this creator and making it feel authentic. So I think that's right off the bat one of the most important things. And then I think with creators in general, you can't just do one and be done. I think that is something that needs to be an always on approach. Not necessarily that you're doing like a specific product launch or collab with a creator, but more just in terms of content generating in general, that needs to be an always on thing. And that's where both from a success standpoint, but also from a learning perspective, as you can iterate more so as you're constantly building a network of creators to see what content is really resonating, hitting well with the audience.
I'll change subjects a little bit. We alluded to it earlier around the skills and attributes of that e-commerce leader at a brand. And you mentioned that on the paid media side, it's much easier to collaborate with potential agencies or tools across the variety of brands that you've worked at. I'm sure that you've in-housed using a tool, leveraged some agencies. I know for sure that you've leveraged some of the largest agencies in retail media, some emerging agencies in retail media. What's been your approach to working with agencies? How do you know the right agency for you? Love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, and I've gone through a gamut of different agencies with different brands. I'm a big proponent, especially for emerging brands, of kind of splitting out the focus with separate agencies. So having the one agency focus on paid search, one agency focus on Meta, one agency focus on TikTok. So I think at a high level, that's how I've approached it, as you have a lot of larger agencies that do buy everything, but getting the specific skill set that you need with each channel, I think, is more important than ever these days. So I think that's one thing that I've been very focused on in finding the right partner for the right channel. Along with that, I think it is having those interviews with the actual team on the accounts as well. I think making sure that the actual skill set, knowledge base with the actual account managers, media buyers that will be on the account, not actually just the team leads or what have you. I think that's something that maybe sometimes can get overlooked, as you'll have some great initial conversations, but you then get passed off to maybe the C or the D team that don't actually follow through or have the same kind of expertise that obviously the leaders you're speaking with are. So I think that's been
Do you explicitly ask that at the beginning of an agency engagement, being like, hey, all of this sounds good. I want to talk to the people that I'm going to be working with?
Yeah, it depends. So I think depending on if it's an agency that maybe I'm new with, yes, that would 100% be the ask. Obviously, there are agencies that I have worked with more extensively or maybe are more boutique that I know the team. So it just depends. But generally speaking, if it's a larger agency, that is a prominent or a primary ask off the bat or through the conversation. And so that, I guess just at a high level, that's how I've looked at it. And then I think maybe seems obvious, but really referrals or word of mouth is definitely one of the most powerful avenues that I've come across agencies in this space. And I think especially with the network, you have a lot of thought leaders and people I trust in the space as well. So having that vouch and validation from other smart digital leaders in the space obviously carries a lot of weight. That's how I've frankly come about or learned about other agencies. And because what I've seen, at least in the space, is that while it's still a small network of people, the amount of great talent out there, great partners out there has expanded quickly. It's impossible to know them all. So I think that's where kind of going back to an earlier comment about not having any ego and not being set in my ways, always networking, always asking people and kind of seeing what I don't know or who I don't know that I maybe should talk with. I think that's been important for myself.
And then on the other side, if you were to advise agencies on being the best possible agency for a brand, what would be your advice?
It's a great question. And I think most agencies that are doing it well, always not resting on your laurels. Like you might be great now, but always looking at the horizon and say, okay, we've got a great team. We've got a great skill set. We've got a great tech-enabled solution, but where do we need to be? Where are things heading in 3 years, 5 years? How can we get out ahead? How can we continue to build our moat around us? Because there's going to be a new agency that pops up in 2 years that doesn't exist now. So how can we defend ourselves around them? So I think that's about continuing to stay at the cutting edge from a client side. That to me is extremely important in seeing that agencies and their roadmap and how quickly they're adding new solutions or solving problems coming from the client side. I think that's key for me just from a long-term perspective, because that makes me feel confident that they're not just going to take our business, manage our business, and then plateau it or sustain it. That just like any digital solution or business constantly needs to be evolving. Seeing an agency have a roadmap to do that is incredibly important, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Wrapping up, we have a final question for every guest, which is, what would be your prediction for 2023 for retail media and e-commerce?
Yeah, I think it's going to be, there's still a lot of question marks about what 2023 will hold. So I won't break out my crystal ball, so to speak. So whether there's a recession or not, or we see inflation continue at its current trend, that withstanding, I think there will be continuing focus on developing kind of closed loop solutions, as I brought that up earlier, but having that closed loop and showing the true kind of full impact of any dollar spent online. That's the biggest ask for marketers, because everybody is asking for money. There's more media networks than there ever has been now on the retail side. A single dollar only goes so far. So there needs to be more justification and data given by some of the retail media networks to, again, ultimately fight for that dollar and say, this is why you should advertise us, because it's driving X, but also XYZ, et cetera. And that's, I think, is really the currency that's going to hold a lot of value for retail media networks. And it's already started. Some obviously already have started rolling out that kind of reporting, more insight, but that's, I think, the biggest ask from the brand side. And that's only going to ramp up or increase next year, I think.
So in a world in which every retail media network wants more dollars, the ones that will win, and we are seeing meaningful investments, are those that are providing measurement, or particularly around the incremental amount of sales one would get with that next dollar being spent on their channel.
100%. And I think breaking down some of those, I guess, silos along with that is you have, that's only on the retail media side, advertising side, that's not accounting for any trade spend, sales, like co-ops. That adds up pretty quickly from a brand perspective. And I think that there will be a reckoning of, so to speak, on that side as well. So I think that's where the sooner retailers can consolidate and break down those silos and have a joint JVP, true JVP with ad and kind of sales will be a crucial lever for them to focus on.
Love it. Calvin, this was an awesome chat. Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it, Adam. This has been great.
In the next episode,
the beauty always for me for digital was that you could understand after someone saw an impression, what did they do? Did they purchase? Did they do what we wanted? And we could optimize in near enough real time. And it was always a panel. It was always a solution to try and work out if an audience did what you were hoping to. And so that was the one of the big sells for digital when it first came out. And that's all becoming much harder. And that's the death of the cookie conversation that's going on.
Join us in the next episode for a chat with Freddie Liversidge, Global Head of Media at HP. The episode drops February 23rd. This is Growth Sessions, a podcast to fuel your e-commerce growth. Listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.